As we discussed in class the other day, the Allied invasion at Normandy was not the end of the war, but it was in every way the beginning of the end. There is a great legend, probably just a legend, but a great story about the German guards who were on lookout on the cliffs of Normandy on the eve of June 6th, or early in the morning of June 6th of 1944. And they scan the horizon and there is nothing to be seen but clouds and ocean. And then they look back and they scan the horizon again. And from one end of the horizon to the other, what they see are ships of war sailing for France. And the one soldier looks to the other and he says the Third Reich is no more. And so the invasion of Normandy as the beginning of the end, but the war went on for almost a year following the Allied invasion at Normandy, and it was a hard-fought battle the whole way. And the last major offensive of the war was called the Battle of the Bulge, and this was a German offensive. They fought back hard against the Allied invasion on the Western Front. And this was fought across the winter of 1944 to 1945. It was fought mainly in the western part of Germany, primarily in Belgium and in northern France in the Ardennes forest. And this one shows as far in as the Germans were able to go. This battle was called the Battle of the Bulge because, as you can see, the battle lines, the front lines, they bulged one way or the other. It was quite an extensive front line, and it just bulged one way or the other, but it was hard fighting across the winter of 1944 to 1945. It was difficult terrain, and it was cold, and the moving was slow but steady, I guess I would say. This picture really says a lot of the difficult conditions that soldiers encountered in the Battle of the Bulge. I have read that a lot of casualties on both sides, the Allied side and the German side, came from not only the cold and the weather and exposure, but also friendly fire that was caused by the difficulty that soldiers encountered in trying to fight in the woods and trying to fight in fog and trying to fight in cold and snow, etc. Another picture of soldiers moving across the landscape during the Battle of the Bulge. And it was very, very cold. Here's a picture of a soldier with his frozen machine gun. He's trying to operate there. But by February of 1945, things were going the Allies' way, and it was not a matter of if, but a matter of when Germany was going to surrender. The Allies were very much on the offensive by then. And the big three met at Yalta to discuss what the end of the war would look like and what the world would look like in the aftermath of the war. Yalta is a resort town in the Soviet Union in Russia. And so we have from left to right Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the American President Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. As I've mentioned several times, Stalin was frustrated by the slow coming of the opening of the Western Front. World War II had been incredibly difficult for the Russians, and they had suffered enormous casualties, probably in the neighborhood of about 20 million casualties, military and civilian. So the war had been incredibly difficult for them. And because of that, Churchill and Roosevelt were really in a position where they felt like they had to make some concessions to Stalin here at their meeting at Yalta, even if it made them uncomfortable. And by this point, in February of 1945, they were in the kind of weird position of the Red Army was pushing out of Russia and into territories in Eastern Europe on their way to Germany. And they were occupying these territories along their way. And so the two leaders of the great Western democracies are sitting there with Joseph Stalin, and they have this problem of needing his help. The Americans wanted the Russians to continue the war after Germany surrendered and engage with them in the fight against Japan. And feeling kind of like they owed him because of how hard the war had been for Russia and the crucial role that they had played in defeating the Germans. But they were also very uncomfortable with the fact and the knowledge that the Soviet army was occupying these vast swaths of Eastern Europe as they came across that territory. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc. And so they put the question to him, hey, Mr. Stalin, are you planning on staying? What are you going to do? And, kind of expressed that they didn't think he should permanently occupy Eastern Europe. And Stalin offered vague assurances that he would hold free and fair elections in Eastern Europe at some time and in some manner to be determined in the future. And Roosevelt was willing to accept that and probably didn't really have much choice. So this was a very important decision that was made there, that Stalin would be able to occupy Eastern Europe at least for some amount of time. There was also the concession to Stalin that the Red Army, which would arrive in Berlin first, Berlin is the capital city of Germany, the Red Army would arrive in Berlin first, that they would be able to enter Berlin first and be able to, let's say, exact a little bit of revenge. And so Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that the Western Allies, that they would hold off on occupying Berlin as they came here. And they also agreed that Germany would be jointly occupied following their surrender. And this would be to ensure the stability of Germany and help them get back on their feet in a way that was pleasing to everyone, because everybody agreed that it didn't go so well after the First World War. Now, take a look at Franklin Roosevelt. He's looking a little haggard here. He was old, he was sick, and the war had taken quite a toll on his health. And this was February of 1945. And the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, died in April of 1945. And this is crucial, it has important consequences. He did not live to see the end of the war. This poster is from 1944, but I love it. Pretty much sums it up. The Germans were surrounded and everybody was pushing in, but they kept fighting, and they kept fighting hard until May of 1945. I like this picture. April of 1945, Allies were closing in from the east and the west, and so it's almost Easter now, and here are some American soldiers offering Easter eggs for Mr. Hitler. May 7th, 1945, cover of Time magazine. Remember in 1938, the cover of Time magazine, I showed you Adolf Hitler was Time magazine's Man of the Year. On May 7th, 1945, he is Time magazine's persona non grata. Interestingly, on this day, historians believe that Hitler, in being faced with the imminent invasion of Berlin by the Soviet army, committed suicide with his mistress, Eva Braun. And I do actually, for the record, believe that that happened. I am not a conspiracy theorist, and I, while it's a fun thing to think about, do not believe that Hitler escaped to Argentina to live the rest of his life in South America. On May 8th, 1945, the Germans surrendered unconditionally. This day is known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. May 8th, 2019, AP European History Exam Day, not quite as important as VE Day, May 8th, 1945, but hopefully a day of celebration and victory for all as well. Here is Churchill greeting crowds in London, giving them the V for victory sign. It was a happy day of celebration. But while VE Day did bring a great mood of happiness and celebration across Eastern and Western Europe, and a great deal of relief probably inside Germany, it was also the start of some really intense troubles. These were not easy times in the immediate aftermath of the war. Here's a picture of the Soviet flag flying over the skyline of Berlin. Look at the city. Look at the dust and the smoke rising up from the bombs. You can see tanks in the street. It was desolate. The Soviet occupation of Berlin, while it was brief, was hostile and brutal. This was a time for revenge, Soviet revenge on the Germans. And I would say the Americans and the British, that they knew this was what it was going to be, and they accepted it as some of the unfortunate costs of war. But for 3 days in Berlin, the Soviets were there, I think, for about a week by themselves. But for 3 days, businesses and houses had to remain unlocked, and that was for the Russian army to be able to come in and take whatever they wanted. There were, during this week, more than 10,000 reported rapes, and so if that many were reported, we can only imagine what kind of devastation, how awful it must have actually and really been. The immediate aftermath of the war was really, really hard. It was brutal. Okay, it has kind of come to be known in history as the savage continent. Europe after the war was savage. In no small part, and this is a kind of a cross section of joy and celebration and intense difficulty, was the liberation of the concentration camps. Now, you guys know about the Holocaust and you've read about it in your other classes, and we haven't spent time talking about it in this class because you know all that. But one of the great questions of the era is that did other people know? And what did they know? Like, did the Americans know about the Holocaust? Did the British know? Well, the French certainly did. We know that the French knew. But I think that's a hard question to answer, and I think the simplest answer is that they knew something bad was happening, and they just decided they had to let that go. Okay, they knew something bad was happening, but there was, or there is, I should say, some pretty strong evidence that they didn't understand the magnitude of what was happening in the Holocaust. And the best evidence of that I am aware of, at least, and I'm certainly not an expert, but the best evidence of that I'm aware of is that the American soldiers, the regular soldiers who liberated the camps, who actually liberated the camps, they were, by and large, not prepared for what they found. They were aware that there were concentration camps, they were aware that there were detention camps, but that they were unprepared for the horrors of what they encountered in liberating the camps. And so here's a soldier, and I don't know if it's American or British, but greeting inmates at one of the concentration camps. A lot of pictures from the liberation are quite gruesome. I'm not going to show you any of those. I think that would be kind of gratuitous. You guys don't need to see that. But here's the inmates of the camp. They're greeting the soldiers with joy, and of course, to know it was over, to have that relief, to know that they had survived. This must be a great moment of relief and of celebration. But the liberation of the camps led to all kinds of chaos. It led to a lot of violence. The Jews were angry, they were upset, they were displaced, they had to figure out what happened, and they weren't in a good mood. And I don't think any of us can blame them. I can blame them for that. But they're just one part of a situation of angst and of chaos and of deprivation in the immediate aftermath of the war, because mixed with all this celebration and relief was coming face to face with the realities of all of this destruction, that homes were gone, that people were gone, they were unaccounted for, that there wasn't enough food and there wasn't enough stuff, and the road back to normal was going to be incredibly long and incredibly difficult. In France, another good example of kind of the brutality that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the war. They had struggled with the war, and I think internally with themselves, with everything that had happened with the German occupation and the Vichy government, and the fact of French collaboration as it had existed during the war, even though the French had resisted a great deal also. And so the part of the French population that took, I guess I would say, the French anger with everything that had happened were women in French society, and particularly women who had either married or become involved in romantic relationships with occupying German soldiers during the war. These women, and this was stuff that was pretty widespread, these women became the object of acts of mob violence and mob humiliation in the aftermath of the war. These women were attacked and publicly humiliated. So you can see in this photograph the two women walking at the front of a mob of people who are cheering and who are laughing at them. Their clothes have been torn and their heads have been shaved, and they have had the swastikas painted on their faces. And this was pretty typical. Things like this happened a lot. There's another photograph of a French woman who has been attacked because of her relationship with a German soldier. And so this is just, I think this time period, this kind of violence, especially in Western Europe, it was quite brief, but it was intense, and it led into, as things kind of calmed down in the immediate aftermath, this kind of realization to say, now the war is over, but gosh, we are in a really, really difficult spot. And there's a lot of issues, certainly, that they had to work through. Women had played a very important role in the Second World War. They did everything in World War II that they did in World War I, and then some. World War II was a total war on an even greater scale than World War I, and we can correctly and accurately talk about World War I as being a total war. All economic production in the war was turned over to the war effort, and maintaining industrial capacity during the war is something that really fell to women to come into factories and to work and to go out into the fields and to work. And in World War II, women even served in auxiliary military positions in the United States and in England. And in Russia, of course, they actually served in combat. Under the communist regime, there were combat pilots, female combat pilots in Russia. They were called the Night Witches. But mostly, women served in auxiliary positions, and they supported the war effort through working, and they supported the war effort through sacrifice. Because economic production was turned over to support the war effort, there literally were not consumer goods to be had, and at least not in any great numbers. So you think about the comforts of life kinds of being restricted, and even in some cases the necessities. It would be incredibly difficult. Consumer goods were rationed, and so something you wouldn't be able to get as much of as you wanted per se would be stuff like sugar or butter or gas for your car, etc. Those things were all rationed. Women couldn't find nylon stockings, and because nylon was diverted to the construction of parachutes and other things like that, and so they started coming up with kind of interesting and other ways to cover their legs, painting them, etc. But World War II, in a lot of ways, it's a good war too, that people voluntarily cooperated in this, that morale called for this, and knew it was a joint effort. Here's some propaganda calling on women to grow their own vegetables so that the produce of the farms could go to the war effort, to voluntarily give things up, etc., so that the armies wouldn't face shortages in the things that they needed. Very much a total war effort, and very much a group effort. And the consumer goods shortages, especially, that came about during the war, became obvious pretty quickly in Europe after the war that those were going to continue. Germany was occupied, and it was rough going in Germany. There were tons of displaced people. Germany had suffered intense bombing. I mean, the destruction was widespread. People didn't have homes. There were a lot of displaced person camps, not only for the liberated Jews, but other people as well, because there was just so much confusion and dislocation after the war. But Germany was to be occupied, and so I like to think of the occupation as kind of thinking of, we're going to babysit them. We're going to see how, make sure things go as smoothly as possible in the immediate aftermath of the war. And this ends up being of huge consequence, because the immediate aftermath of the war, the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were growing, and they were growing fast. Okay, it was always kind of weird that communist Russia and the United States and England were all on the same side in this war. But remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, when you don't have that common enemy anymore, it makes it really, really hard to stay friends. And so what the situation was in Germany is that here everyone was with their armies. So here is the Russian zone of occupation, heavily armed, lots of soldiers. Here's the British zone and the American zone, heavily armed, lots of soldiers. The French were even allowed to have a zone of occupation as well. And there became kind of a very real fear that the war was kind of just on hiatus, that because the armies were there and they were directly facing each other, that the war would just continue between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies, especially the United States. The final meeting of the Big Three occurred in July 1945 at the German city of Potsdam. The new man in the middle is the new American president, Harry Truman. And he was, just from a standpoint of his personality, he's much more of a hardliner. He's much more of a black and white guy than Franklin Delano Roosevelt was. And so he was much less willing to compromise with Joseph Stalin, and he was much less willing to accommodate him. And at Potsdam, here's why everybody thought the war was just about to pick right back up. At Potsdam, he really pushed Stalin hard on when was he going to get out of Eastern Europe, and when was he going to have elections, and when was he going to remove his army. And Stalin didn't want to, and Harry Truman knew that, and so they kind of had a bad moment. They're shaking hands and they're smiling in this picture, but that's covering up kind of a lot of bad feelings and a lot of attention that was emerging. And the decisions that were made, or so to say the lack of those decisions that were made at Potsdam, were key factors in the coming of the Cold War that would emerge during the immediate aftermath of the war, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the United States was still fighting the Japanese in July of 1945 and remained hopeful that the Russians would come and help them in that effort. Interestingly, it was during the meeting at Potsdam that Harry Truman learned that an atomic bomb had been successfully detonated at Los Alamos, New Mexico. And at least the story is that he had no idea we were even making any such thing. But came to be a big factor in both the end of World War II and the Cold War.